The autumn of 1929 painted New England in shades of amber and rust, a beauty that seemed almost mocking given the financial catastrophe unfolding across the nation. In the small town of Millbrook, Vermont, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, the stock market crash felt like a distant thunder, ominous but not yet immediate. The real concern for most residents was the approaching winter and the harvest that needed completion before the first frost. Dr. I. Thomas Ashford stood on the platform of Millbrook Station on October 29th, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he watched the steam rise from the locomotive that had just arrived. He was a man of 42, with graying temples and the perpetually distracted air of someone whose mind was always half elsewhere. As the town's only physician, he'd been called to Burlington for a medical conference, but something else had drawn him there, a telegram from his old colleague, Professor Heinrich Volkmar, a physicist who'd emigrated from Germany 5 years prior. The telegram had been cryptic. Come at once. Discovery of utmost importance. Bring no one. Tell no one. Trust me, old friend. Thomas had shown it to only 3 people: his wife Margaret, his research assistant Daniel Reeves, and his daughter Claire. Margaret had been dismissive, calling Volkmar an eccentric at best and a charlatan at worst. But Claire, 20 years old and filled with the fearless curiosity of youth, had begged to come along. Daniel, 35 and unmarried, had simply packed a bag without asking permission. Now the 3 of them stood together as the conductor called for final boarding. Margaret had stayed home, her parting words still echoing in Thomas's mind. Some doors once opened cannot be closed again. The train ride to Burlington took 3 hours, during which Claire pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape blur past, while Daniel reviewed his notes on electromagnetic theory. Thomas sat in contemplative silence, remembering his university days with Heinrich, 2 young men convinced they could unlock the secrets of the universe through reason and experimentation. Burlington Station was crowded despite the late hour. As they disembarked, Thomas spotted a familiar figure standing beneath a gas lamp, Heinrich Volkmar, though almost unrecognizable. The man Thomas remembered had been robust and energetic, with a booming laugh. This Heinrich was gaunt, his eyes sunken and feverish, his hands trembling as he clutched a leather satchel to his chest. "Thomas," Heinrich gasped, gripping his friend's arm with surprising strength. "Thank God you came. We have so little time." "Time for what?" Thomas asked. But Heinrich was already moving, ushering them through the station and into a waiting automobile, a luxury that seemed incongruous with his shabby appearance. The drive took them out of Burlington, into the countryside, along increasingly rough roads until they reached an abandoned mill beside a rushing river. The building loomed against the darkening sky, its windows broken, its walls covered in creeping vines. Heinrich produced a key and unlocked a side door, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. "Heinrich, what is this?" Thomas demanded, but his old friend was already descending, and Claire, ever impetuous, followed without hesitation. Daniel and Thomas exchanged glances before joining them. The basement had been transformed into a laboratory that would have impressed any research institution. Electric lights powered by a generator illuminated benches covered with equipment Thomas couldn't begin to identify. At the center of the room stood a structure that defied easy description, a circular platform surrounded by copper coils and vacuum tubes, with wires running to batteries and capacitors arranged in intricate patterns. "I've done it, Thomas," Heinrich said, his voice trembling with a mixture of pride and terror. "I've found a way to manipulate temporal flow." Daniel stepped forward, his scientific skepticism evident. "That's impossible. Time is a constant, not a variable." "Is it?" Heinrich moved to a blackboard covered in equations. "Einstein showed us that time is relative, that it bends around mass and velocity. I've simply found another way to bend it, through resonant electromagnetic fields operating at specific frequencies." Claire circled the platform, her artist's eye taking in the aesthetic of the strange machinery. "It's beautiful," she murmured, "like a sculpture." "It's dangerous," Heinrich countered. "I've sent objects forward in time, seconds, then minutes. A pocket watch, a book, a living mouse. They all returned unchanged. But 3 days ago I attempted something larger. I sent my assistant Peter forward 1 hour. Thomas felt his blood run cold. And he didn't return. Not after 1 hour. Not after 24. I've kept the machine running hoping, but..." Heinrich's voice broke. "I fear I've killed him, Thomas. Killed him by sending him somewhere, someone, from which there is no return." The room fell silent except for the hum of the generator and the distant rush of the river. Thomas approached the platform, examining the machinery with a physician's eye for detail. "Why did you call me here, Heinrich? I'm a doctor, not a physicist. Because I need witnesses. Because what I'm about to do requires courage, and I have none left." Heinrich pulled a revolver from his satchel and placed it on a nearby bench. "I'm going to follow Peter. If I don't return within 2 hours, I want you to destroy this machine and all my research. The world isn't ready for this. Perhaps it never will be." "You can't be serious," Daniel protested. "Even if your theory is sound, you have no idea what you're stepping into. There could be paradoxes, causality violations, or it could simply be death," Heinrich interrupted, "which might be preferable to living with what I've done." Before anyone could stop him, Heinrich stepped onto the platform and threw a series of switches. The copper coils began to glow with an eerie blue light, and the air itself seemed to thicken, to become viscous. The temperature in the room dropped precipitously, their breath misting before them. "Heinrich, wait!" Thomas shouted, but his voice seemed to come from far away, distorted. Heinrich looked at them one final time, his expression peaceful. "If you never see me again, know that I died trying to save the boy." The light intensified until it was blinding, accompanied by a sound like thunder being played backwards. Thomas felt Claire grab his hand, felt Daniel steady him as the world seemed to tilt. And then, in an instant, the light vanished. The platform was empty. Heinrich Volkmar had disappeared. Thomas looked at his pocket watch. 9:47 p.m. "We wait 2 hours," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. As he asked, they waited in tense silence, interrupted only by Claire's occasional pacing and Daniel's obsessive checking of the equipment. Thomas sat on a wooden stool, his medical bag in his lap, trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed. Had it been an elaborate hoax? A trick of light and smoke? But no, the sincerity in Heinrich's eyes had been real, as had his fear. At 10:15, Daniel spoke. "The power levels are fluctuating. The generator is overheating." At 10:47, the platform began to glow again, that same blue light suffusing the air. They rushed forward, hope surging, but when the light faded, the platform remained empty. "Maybe he needs more time," Claire suggested, but even she sounded doubtful. At 11:47, exactly 2 hours after Heinrich's departure, Thomas stood. "It's time. We need to shut it down." Daniel moved toward the switches, but Claire grabbed his arm. "Wait, please, just a few more minutes." "Claire, he gave us specific instructions." "I know what he said, but—" She stopped, her eyes widening. "Do you hear that?" At first, Thomas heard nothing. Then, faintly, a sound like wind through a distant canyon, growing steadily louder. The platform began to glow again, but differently this time. The light was unstable, flickering, shot through with colors that seemed wrong, that hurt to look at directly. 2 figures materialized on the platform, their forms indistinct at first, then solidifying. Heinrich collapsed to his knees, gasping, his face ashen. Beside him stood a young man in his 20s, also breathing hard, his eyes wide with shock. "Peter," Heinrich gasped. "I found him. I brought him back." They helped both men off the platform, settling them on chairs as Thomas conducted rapid examinations. Both were hypothermic, their pulses weak and irregular, but alive. Peter stared at his hands as though seeing them for the first time, while Heinrich laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. "Where were you?" Daniel asked. "What did you see?" Heinrich's laughter died. "Nowhere. Nothing. A gray space where time has no meaning, where you float in eternal stasis, aware but unable to move, unable to sleep, unable to die. 3 days for Peter. He's been conscious in that void for 72 hours. Peter began to weep silently, tears streaming down his face. "We need to destroy this," Thomas said firmly. "Now before—" The lights flickered. The generator coughed, its rhythm faltering. Daniel rushed to check the gauges. "We're losing power. The whole system is becoming unstable." The platform began to glow without anyone touching the controls, the light pulsing in an irregular rhythm. Heinrich struggled to his feet, swaying. "It's creating a feedback loop. The temporal displacement is trying to correct itself. We need to leave now." They helped Peter up, supporting him between them as they moved toward the stairs. But before they could reach them, the platform exploded with light, and Thomas felt a pulling sensation, as though invisible hands were dragging him backward. Claire screamed, reaching for him, and he saw Daniel grab for her, saw Heinrich stumbling toward the controls. The last thing Thomas heard was Heinrich shouting something about overload, and then the world dissolved into that terrible blue light, and he was falling, tumbling through a space that was not space, a time that was not time, conscious of nothing but the desperate hope that whatever happened next, his daughter would survive it. When the light faded and Thomas opened his eyes, he was lying on cold stone. The laboratory was gone. He sat up slowly, his head spinning, and found himself in a forest clearing he didn't recognize. The trees were old-growth oak and maple, and the sky above showed stars in unfamiliar configurations. "Claire?" he called out. "Daniel? Heinrich?" His voice echoed in the silence. He stood, turning in a slow circle, and that's when he saw them, 3 figures lying nearby. He rushed to them, his medical training overriding his confusion. Claire was unconscious but breathing, her pulse strong. Daniel stirred as Thomas examined him, groaning. But Heinrich was dead. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and his skin was cold to the touch. In his hand, clutched so tightly that Thomas had to pry the fingers apart, was a piece of paper covered in desperate scrawl. "I'm sorry, I thought I could control it. God forgive me. October 29th, 1929. Thomas checked his pocket watch, but it had stopped at 11:51 p.m. Claire opened her eyes. "Dad, where are we?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted, helping her sit up. "But we're going to find out." Daniel recovered more quickly, his analytical mind already working through their situation. The temporal displacement must have been more severe than Heinrich anticipated. We could be anywhere, or anywhen. They buried Heinrich in the clearing, using rocks to mark the grave. It seemed inadequate for a man who had unlocked the secrets of time itself, but it was all they could do. As Thomas spoke a simple prayer over the grave, Claire picked wildflowers and laid them on the stones. The forest around them was pristine, untouched by human presence. They walked for hours, following a stream downhill, reasoning that water would lead to civilization. The sun rose, revealing a landscape that was both familiar and alien, the same New England topography they knew, but covered in trees that must have been centuries old. It was Claire who spotted the smoke first, rising in a thin column above the treetops. They approached cautiously and eventually came upon a small settlement, but not the kind they expected. The buildings were log cabins, and the people wore homespun clothing that would have looked more appropriate in the previous century. A man chopping wood looked up at their approach, his eyes widening at their strange attire. Where are we?" Thomas asked. The man's confusion was evident. "You're in Millbrook, stranger. Where else would you be? What year is this?" The man set down his axe, taking a step back. "Are you ill?" "It's 1829, of course. October 30th, 1829. Thomas felt the world tilt. Claire gripped his arm, and Daniel made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. They had traveled not just through space but through time itself, 100 years into the past. The first weeks were the hardest. Thomas, Claire, and Daniel found themselves strangers in a world that was simultaneously familiar and foreign. The Millbrook of 1829 bore little resemblance to the town they'd known. Where their homes would one day stand, there was only forest. The roads they'd walked were deer paths. The people they'd known hadn't been born yet, wouldn't be born for generations. They created a story, travelers from Boston whose coach had overturned, leaving them stranded without funds or proper documentation. The community, small and close-knit, was suspicious at first, but Thomas's medical knowledge quickly made him invaluable. When the blacksmith's daughter fell ill with a fever that would have killed her, Thomas's treatment, basic by 1929 standards, miraculous by 1829 standards, saved her life. After that, the questions ceased. They took residence in a small cabin on the edge of town, payment for Thomas's services. Daniel found work as a schoolteacher, his advanced knowledge making him seem like a scholar beyond his years. Claire struggled the most. A young woman in 1829 had far fewer freedoms than she'd enjoyed in 1929, and the constraints chafed at her. But she adapted, finding an outlet in her art, painting landscapes and portraits that locals admired for their unusual perspective. At night, in the privacy of their cabin, they spoke in hushed tones about their predicament. Daniel filled notebook after notebook with calculations, trying to understand what had happened and whether there was any possibility of return. Thomas maintained a journal, recording everything he could remember about their old life, terrified that the memories would fade. Claire painted, capturing images of automobiles and electric lights, telephones and airplanes, things that wouldn't exist for decades, rendered in oils on canvas like impossible dreams. The question that haunted them most: what had happened to Peter? They'd last seen him in the laboratory, but he hadn't traveled with them. Had he remained in 1929? Returned to that gray void Heinrich had described? Or been scattered across some other point in time entirely? Years passed. Thomas's hair turned fully gray, then white. He became respected in the community, though some muttered about his strange ways and stranger ideas. When he suggested boiling medical instruments and washing hands before surgery, he was met with skepticism, until his patients consistently recovered better than those of traditional doctors in neighboring towns. Daniel married in 1835, wedding a young widow named Sarah who ran the general store. It was a practical arrangement at first, but genuine affection grew. They had 2 children, and Daniel struggled with the knowledge that these children existed only because of the accident that had stranded him here. Would they cease to exist if he ever found a way back? The paradox troubled him, so he stopped looking for a way back quite so diligently. Claire remained unmarried, much to the community's concern. She deflected suitors with practiced ease, claiming to be devoted to caring for her aging father. In truth, she couldn't imagine binding herself to this time, couldn't imagine giving up the hope, however faint, of someday returning home. She was a woman of 1929, trapped in 1829, and she felt the disconnect in her bones. In 1842, 13 years after their arrival, something happened that changed everything. A traveling scholar came to Millbrook, giving a lecture on natural philosophy. Thomas, Daniel, and Claire attended, more for the novelty than any real interest. But the scholar's discussion of electricity and magnetism struck a chord. After the lecture, Daniel engaged the man in conversation that stretched late into the night. "There's a theory," the scholar said, "proposed by a British scientist named Faraday. He believes that magnetic fields and electric fields are manifestations of the same fundamental force, and that this force can be manipulated to produce extraordinary effects." Daniel's eyes lit up with an intensity Claire hadn't seen in years. "What kind of effects?" "Well, it's all theoretical, of course, but Faraday speculates that with the right arrangement of coils and magnets, one might be able to generate fields powerful enough to—" He paused, laughing at his own enthusiasm. "Well, to do things we can barely imagine." That night, Daniel sat at their kitchen table, his old notebook spread before him, filling page after page with new calculations. "It might be possible," he murmured. "With 19th century technology, it might actually be possible to recreate a version of Heinrich's machine." Thomas looked up from his medical texts, hopeful and afraid in equal measure. "Daniel, we don't have the materials, the knowledge, the resources. We have time," Daniel interrupted. "All the time in the world, ironically enough. And we have something Heinrich didn't have. We know it works. We know what we're aiming for." Claire set down her paintbrush, her latest canvas forgotten. "How long would it take?" Daniel did rapid calculations. "To gather materials, build the components, test the system? 20 years. Maybe 25. I'd be 60. You'd both be older. But it's possible." They debated through the night. The risks were enormous. They could be killed, scattered across time, or create another accident that harmed innocents. But the alternative was to live out their lives in this century, always wondering, always yearning for a home they could never reach. By dawn, the decision was made. They would try. The work began slowly, necessarily hidden. Daniel couldn't simply announce he was building a time machine. He'd be locked away as a madman. Instead, he positioned himself as an inventor and tinkerer, creating useful devices that slowly built his reputation and resources. An improved water pump here, a more efficient plow there. Each success provided funds for more exotic materials. Thomas helped by leveraging his position in the community. When the town needed a new doctor's office, he specified certain construction requirements: a basement with specific dimensions, walls lined with copper sheets for insulation, electrical grounding that seemed excessive for the era. No one questioned the eccentric doctor's requests. Claire became the project's memory, maintaining detailed records and diagrams hidden in false-bottomed trunks. She also served as their early warning system, cultivating friendships with the town's gossips, ensuring they'd know if anyone grew suspicious of their activities. The 1840s gave way to the 1850s. The nation spiraled toward civil war over the question of slavery, and Thomas found himself in an impossible position. He knew what was coming: the bloodshed, the casualties, the transformation of American society. Should he intervene? Try to prevent the war or at least mitigate its horrors? Or would that create paradoxes that could unravel everything? In the end, he chose limited action. He couldn't stop the war, but he could prepare for it. He trained several promising young people in advanced first aid and surgical techniques, sharing knowledge that wouldn't be discovered for years. When war came in 1861, the field hospitals staffed by his students had notably better survival rates, though no one could quite explain why. Daniel avoided the draft by being too old, but he contributed to the Union cause by developing improved rifles and artillery mechanisms. The irony wasn't lost on him, using future knowledge to make weapons more efficient at killing people, but he reasoned that helping the Union win faster would ultimately save lives. Claire volunteered as a nurse, working in hospitals where she saw horrors that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The contrast between the wars she knew from history books and the brutal reality was almost unbearable, but it also gave her purpose, a way to help that didn't risk temporal paradoxes. The war ended in 1865. They had been in the past for 36 years. Thomas was 78 years old, his hands shaking too much to perform surgery, though his mind remained sharp. Daniel was 69, his hair white, his back bent from decades of work. Claire was 56, the young woman who'd stepped onto Heinrich's platform, now a middle-aged woman with gray streaking her brown hair, but their work was nearly complete. In the basement of Thomas's medical office, hidden behind a false wall, the machine was almost ready. It didn't look like Heinrich's elegant apparatus. They'd been forced to work with cruder materials, larger components, less efficient designs, but Daniel's calculations suggested it would work. "We need to decide," Thomas said one evening in 1868, "whether we're all going or if someone should stay." Daniel shook his head immediately. "Sarah, the children, the grandchildren, I can't leave them. And even if I could, I'm too old for this. The shock alone might kill me." "You were always the cautious one," Claire said gently. She turned to her father. "What about you? You've built a life here, helped so many people." Thomas looked at his aged hands spotted with liver spots, trembling slightly. "I'm dying, Claire. Slowly, but inevitably. The cancer will take me within the year." Claire felt her breath catch. "You knew? How long have you?" "Months. I'm a doctor, remember? I know the signs." He managed a weak smile. "But this gives us an opportunity. The machine needs testing. I'm the logical choice, the one with the least to lose." "No," Claire protested. "We'll find another way." There is no other way, and you know it." Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. "We can't risk Daniel. He has family. You're young enough to build a life if this fails. But me? I'm at the end regardless. Let me do this. Let me be useful one last time." They argued for weeks, but Thomas's logic was irrefutable. In November of 1868, 39 years after they'd arrived, they made their final preparations. Daniel had refined the calculations as much as possible, but uncertainty remained. They couldn't pinpoint exactly where, or when, the machine would send Thomas. They could only aim for their original time and hope. The night before the attempt, Claire and her father sat together in the cabin they'd shared for so long. Outside, the first snow of winter was falling, coating Millbrook in white. "Do you remember Margaret?" Thomas asked. "Your mother? Of course, every day. She was right, you know. That morning we left, she said some doors can't be closed once opened. But I think," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I think she was wrong about whether we should open them. Knowledge, discovery, pushing boundaries, that's what makes us human. We just have to be brave enough to face the consequences." Claire took his hand. "What should I do if you don't come back? Or if you do, but you're—" "Live," Thomas said simply. "Live fully, whether here or in our own time. Don't let this experience make you afraid of living." The next day, November 15, 1868, they activated the machine. Daniel threw the switches and the familiar blue glow filled the basement. Thomas stepped onto the platform, looking at the two people who'd shared this impossible journey with him. "I'll see you soon," he said, one way or another. The light intensified and Thomas vanished. Minutes passed, then hours. Claire and Daniel waited, hoping, fearing. At the 2-hour mark, Daniel began shutting down the machine, but Claire stopped him. "Please, a little longer." They waited through the night. The machine hummed quietly, the generator maintaining the field, but the platform remained empty. As dawn broke, Claire finally nodded, and Daniel began the shutdown sequence. They'd failed. Thomas was gone, scattered across time, or perhaps dead. They'd never know. Claire lived on in Millbrook for another 20 years, becoming a beloved figure in the community, the eccentric artist and nurse who'd never married, who painted strange images and spoke sometimes of things no one understood. Daniel passed in 1885, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved him but never knew the truth of where he'd come from. On her deathbed in 1888, at the age of 76, Claire gave her final instructions to Daniel's eldest son, James. In the basement of the old medical office, there's something hidden. Destroy it. Don't examine it. Don't try to understand it. Just destroy it completely. Promise me. James promised. And after her death, he kept that promise. He tore out the copper coils, smashed the vacuum tubes, scattered the components across Millbrook's growing landfill. The machine that might have let them go home was reduced to scrap and memory. On October 15, 1987, 58 years after the incident at Heinrich Folkmer's laboratory, something impossible happened in Millbrook, Vermont. The town had grown considerably since 1829, though it remained small by modern standards. The old medical office building, long since converted to a historical museum, stood on Main Street, a plaque outside commemorating Dr. Thomas Ashford, pioneer physician, 1829-1868. Few tourists visited, and fewer still paid attention to the building's basement, which housed storage for old records and forgotten exhibits. At 2:37 p.m., the museum's security alarm triggered. The curator, a retired school teacher named Helen Marsh, went to investigate and found the basement door standing open, though she distinctly remembered locking it that morning. A faint smell of ozone hung in the air, and the temperature in the hallway had dropped noticeably. When she descended the stairs, she found a man lying on the concrete floor, unconscious, dressed in clothing from the 1920s. He was perhaps 45 years old, though he looked younger, and he was hypothermic, his lips blue, his breathing shallow. The ambulance arrived within minutes. The paramedics found no identification on the man, nothing to indicate who he was or where he'd come from. More puzzling was his condition. The hypothermia was severe, as though he'd been frozen, but his body showed no signs of frostbite or tissue damage. It was, one paramedic noted, as though he'd been placed in suspended animation. At Millbrook General Hospital, Dr. Sarah Chen examined the patient thoroughly. His vital signs gradually stabilized as his body temperature normalized, but he remained unconscious. She ordered blood work, toxicology screens, and a full workup, all of which came back normal. Remarkably normal, in fact. The man was in excellent health for someone in their 40s. 3 days later, he woke up. The first thing Thomas Ashford became aware of was the sound, a regular beeping that his disoriented mind couldn't place. Then the light, harsh fluorescent rather than the warm glow of gas lamps he'd last seen. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on a ceiling of acoustic tiles, and for a moment he thought he'd died and gone somewhere entirely other. "Mr. Doe?" A voice spoke, female, gentle. "Can you hear me?" Thomas turned his head slowly and saw a young woman in strange clothing, pants like a man might wear but clearly tailored for a woman's form. She wore a white coat, and a strange device hung around her neck, a stethoscope, his medical knowledge supplied, but more advanced than any he'd seen. "Where?" His voice came out as a croak. "Where am I?" "You're in Millbrook General Hospital. You were found unconscious in the old museum building. Can you tell me your name?" Thomas struggled to sit up, and the woman, a doctor, he realized, helped him, adjusting the bed with the push of a button. The bed moved electrically, and Thomas felt a surge of hope so intense it almost hurt. "What year is this?" he asked. Dr. Chen's expression grew concerned. "It's 1987, October 18th. Do you remember what happened to you?" 1987. Thomas's mind raced through the calculations. He'd entered the machine in 1868. If he'd succeeded, if the machine had worked as Daniel hoped, he should have arrived in 1929, right where he'd started. But instead, he'd overshot by 58 years. Or had he? Had he been in that gray void Heinrich described, conscious but frozen for all that time? He checked his hands. They looked the same as they had that last morning. No signs of the tremors and spots he'd noticed before the cancer diagnosis. He started, then stopped. How could he explain? "I need to know what happened to my daughter, Claire Ashford." Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. "The Claire Ashford? The artist? You know her?" "Everyone in Millbrook knows about her. She's something of a local legend. a 19th century artist whose work was incredibly ahead of its time. There's a whole gallery dedicated to her paintings at the museum. She died in 1888. Thomas closed his eyes, grief washing over him. 1888. She'd lived out her life in the past, growing old while he'd somehow been suspended in time. He'd failed her. Mr. Doe, I really need you to tell me your name and what happened to you. Thomas looked at the doctor, at the room around him with its electronic monitoring equipment and plastic IV bags and synthetic materials, and made a decision. My name is Thomas Ashford, and you're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you. Dr. Chen didn't believe him, of course. She called for a psychiatric consultation, convinced her patient was suffering from a dissociative episode or elaborate delusion, but Thomas was patient. He described medical procedures that wouldn't be developed until the 1850s and 60s, which he claimed to have performed. He detailed the layout of Millbrook in 1829, information that could only have come from historical records or personal experience. Most convincingly, he described the hidden basement of the old medical office building, the machine that had once been there, details that matched the strange copper sheeting in the walls that had always puzzled historians. A historian from the State University was called in, Professor Raymond Cartwright, a specialist in 19th century Vermont history. He brought with him copies of Claire Ashford's paintings and Thomas Ashford's medical journals, both preserved in the museum's collection. When Thomas saw Claire's paintings, canvases showing automobiles and airplanes, telephones and skyscrapers, all rendered with the distinctive style of the 1800s, but depicting scenes from the 1920s and 30s, he wept openly. She'd been leaving him messages, painting their memories so that if he ever returned, he'd know she'd never forgotten. These are your memories, Professor Cartwright said slowly, beginning to believe. She painted these from your descriptions. She painted them from life, Thomas corrected. We lived in 1929 before we were displaced. These aren't imaginings. They're documentation. The professor opened one of Thomas's medical journals, preserved in protective plastic. There's a passage here near the end. November 15, 1868. Today I attempt to return home knowing I may fail, but unable to live with myself if I don't try. To whoever reads this, I was Thomas Ashford, physician, born in 1887 and displaced to 1829 when I was 42 years old. I lived a full life in the wrong century, helped people who never should have known me, and loved a daughter brave enough to endure the impossible. If this journal survives, let it stand as proof that time can be traversed, that the laws of physics are more flexible than we imagine, and that human will and courage can overcome even temporal exile. Thomas stared at the words he'd written 119 years ago, preserved through the careful stewardship of generations. I wrote that the morning I left. I was dying, you see. Cancer. I didn't think I had more than a few months left. But you're not dying now, Dr. Chen observed. Your tests are all normal. Perfect, in fact. The temporal displacement, Thomas murmured, understanding dawning. It must have suspended my biological processes. I entered the machine sick and dying in 1868, but from my body's perspective, no time passed. I'm still 42 years old, still in the exact condition I was in that day. Over the following weeks, as Thomas recovered and began to adjust to 1987, Professor Cartwright assembled a team of physicists, historians, and medical professionals to document his case. The evidence was overwhelming. Dental records that matched, a physical description that perfectly aligned with contemporary accounts, knowledge that couldn't be faked or fabricated. The media descended on Millbrook when the story broke, skeptical at first but gradually convinced by the sheer weight of evidence. Thomas Ashford, a man who'd been dead for 119 years, had returned, having not aged a single day. Scientists from around the world came to study him, to understand what had happened. The consensus, eventually, was that the primitive time machine had created a stable temporal loop, a closed time-like curve that had suspended Thomas in a state between moments, neither here nor there, until the loop finally resolved and deposited him as close to his origin point as the degraded field could manage. You're a miracle, one physicist told him. You've proven that Einstein was right, that closed time-like curves are possible. You've shown us that time travel isn't just theoretical. But Thomas felt no triumph, only a profound sense of displacement. Everyone he'd known in 1929 was long dead. Margaret, his wife, had died in 1951 at the age of 72. The town he'd known had transformed beyond recognition. The world had endured a Great Depression and 2 world wars, had developed nuclear weapons and landed men on the moon, had created computers and satellite communications and technologies that seemed like magic even to someone who'd traveled through time. He walked the streets of modern Millbrook, seeing the ghosts of both centuries overlaid on the landscape. There was the corner where the blacksmith shop had stood in 1829, now a convenience store selling lottery tickets and magazines. There was the field where he and Claire and Daniel had landed after the displacement, now a shopping plaza with parking lots and streetlights. And there, on a hill overlooking the town, was the cemetery. Thomas visited it on a cold October morning, exactly 1 month after his return. He found Claire's grave easily. It was well maintained, even featured in tourist brochures as the resting place of visionary artist Claire Ashford, 1909-1888. The dates were wrong, of course. She'd been born in 1909 but had lived in 1829. Time had gotten confused around her, as it had around him. Next to Claire's grave was Daniel's, and scattered around them were Daniel's descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren stretching down the generations. Thomas did the math and realized that through Daniel, there were probably hundreds of people alive today who existed only because of that accident in 1929. He found another grave, smaller and nearly forgotten in a corner of the old section, Peter Volkmer, 1904-1930. Thomas stood before it for a long time, reading the inscription, "Lost but not forgotten. May perpetual light shine upon him." Peter had made it back then, only to die within a year. Had he been unable to readjust? Had the trauma of his experience in the gray void been too much? Thomas would never know. The final grave he sought took more effort to find. It was in an even older section, the stone weathered almost smooth. Heinrich Volkmer, 1887-1929. Thomas had buried Heinrich himself in a forest clearing that was now part of someone's backyard. Somehow the body had been found, identified, and brought here for proper burial. "I'm sorry," Thomas said to the stone. "You were trying to save someone and instead you doomed us all. But I forgive you, old friend. How could I not, when you were only trying to do good?" That evening, Thomas sat in a hotel room, a luxury he was still getting used to, and watched television. The news was full of his story. Experts debating its implications, skeptics demanding more proof, believers celebrating the confirmation of their wildest theories. But Thomas wasn't watching the news. He'd found a documentary channel showing a program about World War I, and he watched with the sick fascination of someone who'd missed it but knew people who'd lived through it. He thought about all the moments he'd skipped, the history he'd bypassed by being frozen in time. There was a knock at his door. Dr. Chen stood in the hallway looking uncertain. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I just wanted to check on you, make sure you're adjusting. As well as can be expected, I suppose." Thomas invited her in, and they sat awkwardly in the too modern furniture. "I've been reading Claire's journals," Sarah said. "The museum gave me access as part of my medical research into your case. She wrote about you constantly, about how much she missed you, how she hoped you'd made it home. But I didn't," Thomas said quietly. "I overshot by 58 years. I'm further from home than ever." "Are you, though?" Sarah pulled out a photograph, showing one of Claire's paintings. It depicted a street scene in Millbrook, but futuristic. Cars that looked like those of the 1980s, buildings of glass and steel, people in modern dress. She painted this in 1885, 3 years before she died. The caption in her journal says, "For Father when he arrives, welcome to the future." Thomas stared at the painting, and something in his chest tightened. Claire had known. Somehow she'd known he wouldn't return to 1929, that he'd overshoot into an era even stranger to him than the 1800s had been. And she'd left him this message across a century, telling him it was okay, that she'd thought of him, that she'd hoped he'd find happiness wherever, whenever, he landed. "I have to decide," Thomas said, "whether to help them try to recreate Heinrich's work. The government has approached me, scientists have approached me. They want to build a new machine, study the phenomenon, maybe even send people back deliberately. What will you tell them?" Thomas thought about Margaret's warning, about doors that couldn't be closed. He thought about all the lives that had been disrupted, all the unintended consequences. But he also thought about Claire's paintings, about Daniel's children and grandchildren, about all the patients he'd saved with future medical knowledge. "I'll tell them what I told my daughter the night before I left. Knowledge and discovery are what make us human, but we have to be brave enough to face the consequences. And we have to make sure those consequences are ones we can live with. He looked out the hotel window at Millbrook spread below, a town that had been his home in 3 different centuries. Somewhere out there, in archives and museums, in the very stones of the old buildings, were traces of the lives he and Claire and Daniel had lived. They'd left their mark on history, subtle but indelible. The past is gone, Thomas said finally. Claire and Daniel, Margaret and Heinrich, they're all gone. I can't go back to them, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is to honor them by living fully in whatever time we're given, by using what we know to make things better. And if helping them means more accidents, more people displaced, then we learn from our mistakes and do better. That's all we can ever do. Sarah stayed for another hour and they talked about less weighty things. What foods Thomas had missed, what technologies amazed him most, what he thought about music and movies and the internet, which she had to explain to him slowly. When she left, Thomas sat in the dark thinking. He was a man out of time, displaced not once but twice, separated from everything he'd known and loved by the unbridgeable gulf of years. He should feel lost, hopeless, destroyed. But instead he felt something else, possibility. He was 42 years old, healthy despite having been dying, in a world full of wonders and challenges. He had knowledge of 3 different eras, had lived through experiences no one else could claim. He could wallow in grief for what he'd lost, or he could embrace what he'd gained. The next morning, Thomas Ashford walked into Millbrook General Hospital and asked if they needed a doctor. He had skills to share, lives to save, and a future to build. The past could take care of itself. In the museum, Claire's paintings hung in their gallery, silently speaking across the years. Airplanes and automobiles, electric lights and telephones, skyscrapers and satellites, all rendered in the distinctive style of the 1800s, all bearing witness to an impossible journey. And in the corner, one final painting that few visitors noticed, a portrait of a middle-aged man with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, smiling slightly, with a caption in Claire's hand, "My father, forever young." Thomas visited the gallery often, standing before that portrait, seeing himself as Claire had seen him, not as a victim of temporal displacement or a scientific curiosity, but simply as a man who'd done his best in impossible circumstances. And in those moments across the gulf of a century, he felt her presence, felt Daniel's, felt the connections that time couldn't sever. He lived. That was his choice, his defiance against the universe that had scattered him across the years. He lived fully and well, honoring those who'd been lost, embracing those yet to come, present in the only moment that ever really exists, now. And if sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, he wondered what might have been, what life he might have lived if Heinrich's machine had never existed, if he'd grown old with Margaret, seen Claire married and happy in her own time. Well, those were questions without answers, doors that couldn't be reopened. The past was another country and he could never go home again. But perhaps, Thomas thought, perhaps he'd been home all along in the only place that mattered, here in this moment, alive and aware and grateful for the extraordinary gift of existence, however scrambled across the centuries it might be. The story of Thomas Ashford, Claire Ashford, and Daniel Reeves became legend, debated and analyzed, studied and mythologized. But for Thomas, living it day by day in 1987 and beyond, it was simply life, strange and wonderful, tragic and triumphant, impossible and absolutely real. And that, in the end, was enough.